Good morning, everyone, and thank you all for joining me for Talentful's second webinar this morning. I hope that working from home isn't driving you all too stir crazy and that you find today useful, whether it's a refresh or a brush up on some areas that you already know, or whether this is brand new information for you. The topic of unconscious bias and how it can affect the recruitment process is definitely more prevalent than ever. And we've been working with many of our clients to support on driving awareness on this subject amongst their teams and with our wider hiring community. So first things first, my name's Catherine and I'm the Associate Director for the Scale Up team at Talentful. So if you're not already aware, Talentful are a specialist in providing in-house talent solutions to companies with tech at their core. So we help industry leaders like Google DeepMind, Depop and Starling Bank build great tech teams. I joined Talentful just over a year ago and I've had previous experience working in fast-paced scaling organizations for the last 4 years across a range of industries, working for businesses such as Agilysys, PaymentSense, and WeWork. And the main function of my role is to help businesses scale by partnering, advising, and educating talent teams on their processes and strategy, which definitely keeps me busy. So what do we want to get out of today? Unconscious bias can have a detrimental effect on attracting, hiring, and retaining great talent. And this webinar hopefully will shine spotlight on where bias can creep into the hiring process and how you can take steps to mitigate it from your own practices. Hopefully we'll come away from today understanding what unconscious bias is, how it can influence workplace decisions, and all of us committing to taking at least one action to mitigate the influence of unconscious bias. If you do have any questions, feel free to pop them in the comments box and we'll try and get to them at the end. And I'll also send through the slides and recording for you at a later date. So first things first, whether we care to admit it or not, everyone has biases. And the important thing is being honest with ourselves and being more aware of what our biases are and making sure that we try to remain as objective as possible when we are faced with them. But you're not alone, we all have this in common, and it's important that we all are aware of how we can potentially bring this to the conscious mind. So what exactly is a conscious bias? So I suppose the best way to describe it is that it's a learned stereotype that are automatic, unintentional, and deeply ingrained within our beliefs. We don't necessarily consciously think about these assumptions, but they do have the ability to affect our behaviour. For example, if you're stuck in a car park with a flat tyre and you needed some help, you looked around the car park for someone to ask, chances are you'd probably be most likely to approach a man rather than a woman if you needed assistance changing it. And this would be based on previous experience or ideas that we've had in the past. For example, potentially seeing our dad fixing the car when we were in our childhood, or that it appears to us that when we do go to a car garage, a higher amount of mechanics are male. And whilst this unconscious bias may seem innocent, problems can arise when unconscious biases make their way into the workplaces and assumptions are made. So let me demonstrate what I mean with a quick exercise just to get us warmed up. So this is actually taken from one of Scott Horton's presentations. It's nice and simple. Feel free to submit your answers into the comment section. What do you think this simple statement says? And what's the first thing that comes to mind? I'll give it a couple of minutes, see if anything comes through. I know what I'm jumping to when I first read that. Yeah, I've got a couple of things coming through. So it seems that the general consensus is that ice cream is good. Surprise! So this shows that the brain isn't perfect. And what it doesn't know, it assumes from things it has seen or heard before. It fills in the gaps. And in the workplace, this can affect the way you attract, hire, develop, and retain our talent. Ultimately, bias is an extremely functional trick that our brains have learned. Our brain is able to quickly filter huge amounts of information, and prioritizing, categorizing, and summarizing our surroundings for us unconsciously. We make thousands of quick decisions every day without having to think about them. And this served well for us a million years ago when our unconscious biases were ultimately helping us avoid being eaten by a tiger. But we do live in a different world today. The need for filtering is just as important in situations such as avoiding cars when you're crossing the road, or ordering your coffee in the morning, or even deciding on where to sit on the bus or the tube. And most of what we're thinking and deciding is driven by unconscious processing, which is very functional most of the time, but it can also lead us astray. So what does this mean? Unconscious bias can lead to many types of undesirable outcomes within our hiring processes. It can lead to differences in the way that we attract, hire, develop and retain people from underrepresented groups. It has been shown that biases can have an impact on recruitment, mentoring and promotions. And if this is left unchecked, these can result in intentional discrimination, which legally and financially poses a great risk to your business and its reputation. But it also means that potentially poor decisions are made off the back of these assumptions and inadvertently sabotage the best intentions of developing a diverse and inclusive organisation. Which means that we'd be creating barriers within our business and potentially missing out on amazing talent or a different set of skills that would greatly benefit the organisation and its ability to grow and meet customer requirements, which ultimately is our aim. It can also have a negative impact on how we manage or on those that we are currently managing that are already in our teams. Studies have shown that those who feel they are potentially being discriminated against, it can negatively impact their engagement and satisfaction at work. And this can manifest itself in a number of harmful ways to both our employees and the business as a whole, including lowered productivity, lack of morale, and the increased risk that amazing talent will leave your business. So therefore, driving awareness of unconscious bias and actively engaging in efforts to reduce it should be a core component of any company's diversity and inclusion strategy, which is why I'm sure that we're all here today. And as mentioned, it can essentially provide the foundation for discrimination or discriminatory behaviour. And as we addressed just before, these seemingly innocent and automatic assumptions can potentially lead to undesirable outcomes. So the point I want to touch upon here is the potential financial implications that this can have up and above what the impact on our company reputation or what our reviews are on Glassdoor. So according to Expert HR, there is no financial limit on the compensation that can be rewarded for a discrimination claim. I know when I first read that fact, I was quite taken aback by it, but damages aim to cover all harm that comes directly or indirectly from the behaviour that is defined as unlawful discriminatory conduct. I won't go into too much detail on this now, but ultimately this can include financial loss and compensation for personal injury, both mental and physical, and it can also include compensation for injury to feelings. So to put it into context, I wanted to have a quick look at a real life example of where perceived discrimination can occur. So again, according to this case that I took from Expert HR, Mrs. O was a Black African employee of a well-known restaurant chain, and she was looking to relocate to the York branch after a year of service while she was studying. So she spoke to the manager of the York branch, we'll call him Mr. W, over the phone, who was happy with her experience and offered her a trial shift and stated that if her performance was satisfactory, he would offer her a role. So she went ahead, she had the interview, she had the trial shift, and the interview ended with Mr. W stating that he would speak to her current manager and get back to her. But the following day, he informed Mrs. O that he'd spoken to her manager and that there was actually no role for her. So when she checked with her manager, she was informed that they had not been contacted by anyone from the York branch. And a few weeks later, she actually went and visited the same restaurant. Mrs. O noted that there were new employees undergoing training, and the supervisor confirmed to her that the restaurant had been recruiting for several weeks. So just having a bit of a think about that situation, like, what do you think? Do you think personally that she would have grounds for a claim if she took this to tribunal? The outcome is that she did, and she won on the grounds of racial discrimination. But why did she win? So the tribunal found that Mr. W's motivation in rejecting her application was unclear, irrational, and illogical, given her competence and previous experience, and her manager at her current place of work regarded her as an excellent employee. The tribunal ruled that there was no evidence to show she'd been treated favourably, and actually said that she'd been treated unfavourably on the ground of race. There was not a credible explanation for why Mr. W had changed his position on Mrs. O between his initial telephone discussion with her, where he said that he really liked her experience, and actually at the end of her trial shift. At the tribunal, the company stated the reason for refusal for her transfer request was that Mr. W felt that he was not the right fit, and that was the evidence that he actually gave at tribunal. As you can imagine, there was a lack of satisfactory evidence to prove why this was the case, At the time of the interview, Mr. W was recruiting, and Mrs. O's experience was relevant for the position he was hiring for. She was regarded as an ideal candidate, as her experience matched that of the roles that he was recruiting for at that time. So she wasn't looking for she was looking for a direct transfer. There wasn't a change in her role or seniority other than location. And following that, Mr. W had recruited 17 non-Black employees in the 6-month period following Mrs. O's interview. And due to the lack of evidence to suggest otherwise, the tribunal came to the conclusion that the reason for his decision to refuse her a role, whether conscious or subconscious, was her race. So there may have been another reason behind Mr. W deciding not to hire Mrs. O, but due to the lack of evidence, it left the business vulnerable. And this is why objective interview notes, as well as the proper collation of feedback, and the reasons why a candidate is not progressing through the process is so important. So it leads quite nicely into how unconscious bias can affect our hiring process and the steps that we can take to mitigate it. So first and foremost, looking at the attraction piece. If we're not appealing to potential employees from underrepresented backgrounds, we are essentially narrowing our talent pool and potentially missing out on that incredible talent. And this is particularly prevalent in industries such as tech, where businesses are consistently competing for high-level skills. And unconscious bias can affect strategies that businesses take to attract these skill sets. So if we look at websites or careers pages, for an example, particularly in tech, it can show young white or Asian males, lots of ping pong tables, lots of alcohol, really, really social, which is great if that's what you're looking for. But what about everything else? What about amazing healthcare or parental leave or childcare options that send out messages to prospective talent that are just as important? These can generally be overlooked. Looking at also job descriptions, they can often use language that can potentially deter diverse talent by impacting the perception of the job seeker that they would actually belong in that business. So particularly, again, in a lot of tech organizations, there's a lot of attempts to make job descriptions more dynamic and appealing, where the use of phrases such as ninja or rockstar are quite common. But in actual fact, this can have the opposite effect. Sourcing also plays an important role in this. If businesses are only targeting very specific organizations or specific educational backgrounds, this can impact the breadth of diversity, as well as significantly reducing the candidate pool. It's a good time to also mention that the referral programs need to be monitored, as this can also impact the diversity of your talent pipeline. And company reputation, as mentioned before, is also key. If the representatives of your business at panel talks or other public events are the same demographic every time, this can send a subtle message that underrepresented groups are underrepresented in that business, which can ultimately reduce the attraction of working for that organization. So what can we do to mitigate this? Let's put ourselves under the microscope. Ask yourself the question, are we welcoming to all employees? Include pictures on your website of people from different backgrounds and shout about those amazing benefits that you offer. If you offer extended maternity and paternity leave, that's great. You should definitely shout about it. If you have a highly flexible working policy, this is also incredibly valuable for candidates to know. There are also some tools out there such as Textio, where you can run adverts to make sure language is gender neutral and inclusive. And creating guidelines for job descriptions is also helpful for the wider business to keep them on track. Proactively source up and above your referral network and consider goals for your talent pipeline. Look at potentially looking at a certain percentage that's been sourced or a certain percentage that comes from referrals, for example, to keep the pools open. And support candidates from underrepresented backgrounds. Encourage diverse employees to speak on public panels and develop public profiles. Not only does this help all of your employees feel empowered, but an inclusive message will be sent out to potential applicants that everybody has a seat at the table. So moving on to hiring. This is an area where a number of issues can arise and where unconscious biases can creep in. So first and foremost, CV screening. We all know that CVs aren't necessarily the most detailed picture that we can have of a candidate. So CVs can often encourage shortcuts and quick decisions which are more open to being influenced by bias. And they often provide quite limited information. So we have that high level information about certain projects that they've worked on. We obviously have their name, where they were educated, and where they've worked previously. But does it tell you about how they manage stakeholders, or how they problem solve, or how they collaborate as part of a team? An example of where this can creep in, according to an article by Lever, CVs with white-sounding names received 50% more calls for interviews than the exact same CVs with black-sounding names. So it just shows like where that unconscious bias can creep in, even without us realizing it. Another common thing to be aware of is filtering by red brick universities or the prestige of a former company can also be influenced by similar bias, and therefore filtering out other potential talent from different backgrounds. For example, if you've got someone who's worked for maybe a lesser known organization, because the business is smaller, they may have had more opportunity to work on a wider diversity of projects and could ultimately add value. So it's definitely worthwhile considering them. The other part where unconscious bias can definitely creep in is interviews. I'd say this is probably the prime setting, as a lot of assumptions are generally made on that first impression. So confirmation bias can be particularly prevalent at this stage, which is the tendency to search for or interpret information in a way that confirms your existing beliefs. So for example, you jump on a video call with a candidate, or you meet them for the first time in person, and ultimately in the first few seconds, you make an assumption, as we do whenever we meet anybody. And then ultimately, we spend unconsciously the rest of that meeting or call looking for information that backs up that initial first impression. So it's important that we call this out right at the start. Another thing to be aware of is the cultural fit interview. The cultural fit is a common phrase that's used at interview stage, and generally these are quite unstructured, get a bit of a feel for what that individual is like as a person. But by doing this, are we essentially reducing diversity? So there's actually a great article by Fast Company that suggests that we are actually doing that, as these culture fit interviews ultimately boil down to a gut feeling of good chemistry or rapport that interviews get from the candidate rather than getting structured information from them. Or in more simple terms, do I think I will actually like working with this person? Not, are they the best person for the job? And looking at candidate evaluation, ultimately, all of these previous stages feed into the final decision that is made about a candidate and whether we look to hire them into our business. These unconscious beliefs about particular groups can not only impact our expectations, but potentially influence how we pay attention or process information in the actual interview itself. So Forbes has a great article on this, where it explains that a Yale University study found that male and female scientists that were actually both trained to be objective were more likely to hire men and consider them more competent than women, even if they both performed well at the interview. So again, how can we mitigate this as a business? So some ways to mitigate that unconscious bias increasingly involve standardizing and structuring your recruitment process so that all candidates are benchmarked in the same way and against the same criteria. So a helpful thing to consider is, before you even source a single candidate, build an ideal candidate profile and a recruitment process that will help you suss out the most qualified candidates that match that profile. Then next steps would be to use a structured interview process and use scorecards, so everyone is evaluated in the same way, and specific examples from interviews can be taken to justify giving a candidate a certain score rather than having an unstructured conversation. A useful thing to do, particularly if you are looking to benchmark and use a scoring system with candidates, is define what an absolutely amazing answer, an average answer, and a poor answer looks like before the interviews take place, and share this with everyone within the hiring team. And if we are looking at culture ads rather than culture fit, we can benchmark candidates against values and key behaviors that are important to your business and not just on that likability factor. So another thing to be aware of is it's not just how unconscious bias can affect the hiring process before we bring someone into the organization, but how this can continually impact employees once we've hired them. For example, mentoring and support, who ultimately has access to whom, the opportunity for training and career development, and also advancement opportunities, as well as performance reviews, can all be impacted. Numerous studies show that across all of these processes, employees who share similar backgrounds with their managers and company leaders, whether it's gender, ethnicity, culture, education, interest, the list goes on, are at a distinct benefit. So according to the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, manager and senior executive roles in the private sector are still 86% white and 70% male. And what does this ultimately mean? It means that it'll cost you later down the line. So whether bias is perceived or real, it can result in those high levels of employee disengagement that I touched upon earlier, as well as a higher turnover, but it also can limit innovation and knowledge sharing. So the key things that we need to ask ourselves are, what behaviors are we trying to breed? And are we unconsciously promoting a trait? And really bring the microscope down onto our processes when we're developing our people. What can we do to make sure that we are developing our teams fairly? We can add structure again to processes. So looking at performance evaluations or promotions, do we have a competency framework in place? These will be fairer and more objective. And the expectation of the employees will also be clear. Monitor for bias. For example, studies have shown that women are less likely to nominate themselves for promotion rather than men, which ultimately results in a lower promotion rate for women. So you can redesign the process and encourage managers to nominate those who they feel are ready for promotion. Consider creating career development programs for employees from underrepresented backgrounds and ensuring that they all have access to the resources and opportunities that they need to succeed. And finally, encourage your employees to build networks both internally and externally. And this can help mitigate informal relationships that potentially could unfairly benefit employees who are actually part of a majority group. So building on the career progression, which is a key part of both developing and retaining staff, it's worthwhile considering how perceived or unconscious bias can manifest itself in benefits and culture. For example, you may say that you have a flexible working policy, but is there a stigma attached to those who actually use it or have set arrangements? Are they perceived as part-time in doing so? These are all things that we need to be conscious of, as to not create an environment that's potentially exclusive. Company cultures are typically created and cultivated by the majority group members, and at times this can appear unwelcoming, even in subtle ways, to people from underrepresented backgrounds. Another thing to consider here is the factors that determine on how pay is set and how this can potentially perpetrate bias. So Dr. Julie Davies of the University of Huddersfield concurs that the root of the gender pay gap is actually formed very early on. So the Independent reported a little while ago that she stated, this happens when women don't negotiate their salary in their first role due to societal pressures. So there's a cumulative effect as they move from one job to another. And often women don't ask for more money and are just grateful to be offered a job. So this is one example of a study, but it's something to be aware of. So how can we put in processes that mean that pay and in line with promotion, but also performance is viewed correctly, objectively, and fairly? So ultimately, we can continually monitor compensation data and ensure that policies around setting compensation don't perpetrate bias that can help a company identify, address, and avoid these issues. The most obvious one would be to ask your employees what they think. Like asking questions, sending around surveys about employees' perceptions and their intent to actually stay with your business is a great idea on how you can improve and also what you're doing well, particularly if you break this down by demographic groups. This feedback loop should also include benefits and ensure that they are relevant and attractive to all employees, and these should be done pretty regularly. Educate employees about how bias can affect company culture and encourage them to participate in diversity efforts. Increasing awareness of bias and arming employees with the skills and confidence to call it out when they see it is really, really important. For example, being thoughtful about the physical workspace or calling out any posters that are potentially offensive or planning events that are going to be inclusive for all team members. So we talked a lot about having a diverse workforce, but what are the key benefits? So a large number of studies show that diverse and inclusive workplaces, the workplaces where there are members of different social and cultural groups and they're both seen and heard, outperform homogenous workplaces. There's an increased adaptability, so it provides a greater variety of perspectives and solutions to problems. Better customer service. There's a greater range of skills, abilities, and also empathy for different cultures, which can better meet the needs of customers around the world. Greater innovation. The workforce diversity and inclusion piece is a key driver of internal innovation and business growth and encouraging that knowledge sharing. And finally, recruitment and retention. Welcoming candidates, regardless of race, gender, age, or background, means that you can hire from a larger pool of people and have access to more talent. Embracing diversity can also improve existing staff members' loyalty as well. And all of these feed into an inclusive and diverse working environment that is integral to company success. So pulling this all together, as a business, what should we be doing to mitigate unconscious bias from our processes? Let your data do the talking and use this to justify decisions. If you're held accountable, you're less likely to be unconsciously biased. Make decisions collectively. If we're all involved, we can keep each other's unconscious biases in check. Start setting goals for diversity and track on how we are performing against them. Look at your processes and see where you can put things in place to support this. For example, committing to diverse hiring panels or ensuring all job adverts are gender neutral, bringing in blind CV reviews and also blind tech test and work sample marking. I suppose that all feeds into really making the recruitment process as objective as possible. So touching again on scorecards, structured interviews, defining criteria at the start, and also having a commitment to objective feedback contribute to helping build a diverse workforce and support in overcoming our pre-learned biases. Remember, this isn't just down to HR, like everyone plays a part in this, and we should make a commitment as an organisation to recognise and call out unconscious bias, and it should be made okay to do so. We're not always going to get it right. There's sometimes that we can make mistakes, but it's all part of the learning process. So what should we be avoiding as a business to try and prevent bias? So first and foremost, avoid engaging in unstructured interviews. That beer test, the airport test, be gone. No longer are we going to do that. Stop letting preconceived ideas skew CV reviews. And when you're collating feedback, don't accept a simple yes or a no. Provide objective criteria or push for it if you're the hiring team, as I imagine quite a few of you are, as to why candidates aren't progressing. Avoid having one person do every interview stage. If we have multiple interviewers, there's varied experiences and ultimately means a well-rounded opinion. And finally, avoid ignoring diversity altogether. It's not going to go away, and it's the key to being ahead of the curve and finding the best possible talent. But there's also things that we can do on an individual basis. First off, you need to be honest and aware of what your own biases are, so that you can recognize them when they are coming into play. A good example of how you can do this actually is the implicit association test, which is administered by Harvard University. And ultimately what it does is measures the reaction time of individuals to a series of words or pictures and can actually help you understand what your potential biases may be. So I think there's thousands and thousands of these online that you can actually review, and it's actually showed that there are certain backgrounds that have distinct biases. It's a really interesting thing to have a look at if you have some time. And then increase your exposure to your biases. So surround yourself with positive words and images about people that you may have stereotypical thoughts about to help eliminate those negative biases. A good thing to consider as well is paying attention to your choices when you're feeling tired, rushed, or stressed, as these situations can actually activate our biases, as you'd probably imagine. And probably the most important is making sure that you back yourself up with written evidence for the decisions that you make, particularly when you're hiring and promoting in your business. Make sure that this is constructive and objective, and it's also stored correctly, should this need to be used at a tribunal. But hopefully you won't get to that point. So I guess the final thing that I wanted to comment on is I'd love you to think about or take away from today, what is the one commitment that you will personally make to help mitigate unconscious bias in your organisation. So whether that's increasing your exposure or improving a process, write down that thought and keep it as a constant reminder. So I've actually got through that a little bit faster than I thought. It's quite a lot of detail there, so I hope you're all still with me. I really hope you enjoyed today's webinar and you found it really useful. I think a couple of questions have actually come through, which I will go through, but if there's anything that you'd like to ask in the meantime, please feel free to pop them through. So one of the questions I have here at the moment is, how can we ensure that unconscious bias training is impactful even after it's been delivered? So I think this is a great question. I think this is something that has been mentioned quite a few times, that, you know, how effective is unconscious bias training? Now, ultimately, it takes time to learn, and it ultimately takes even more time to unlearn harmful behaviors or beliefs. So conducting one training session or getting an external provider to come in, one session isn't going to remove all the biases from your organization. It does take practice and intentional effort to really sustain that behavior change, not just for the business itself, but for you as an individual. So in order for that to stick, then the dialogue must continue. So some of the suggestions I'd make is scheduling some recurring small discussion groups after running your initial workshop to unpack and digest and reinforce the learnings. You could potentially use these to provide additional training that builds on the knowledge that they've just gained. Maybe look at some examples of how they've gone on to de-bias feedback or make their performance reviews more objective or set inclusive goals. And those could be some really great potential follow-up training topics for different groups. One of the questions actually just come through is, hiring managers who are keen for a diverse team may say something like, I want this hire to be a woman, and may refuse to accept male CVs or hold male applicants to higher standards. And what do I think about this kind of hiring? So I think it is a challenge that we come across. I think maybe that comes from us wanting to be more diverse as an organisation. I think sometimes it comes with the best intentions, but actually almost positive discrimination in a way. And when I've been in that position myself previously, when I've been talking to my hiring managers, my first response is, my job as a recruiter for you is to help you find the best person. So, you know, I will try and make a more targeted effort with my sourcing to find more female candidates and try and keep our pipelines as equal as possible. But if I find a really great person who's a man, I'm still going to put them forward because I don't want you to miss out on the best talent. I think it is an education piece. I don't think there's a really easy answer to that one. A lot of it may depend on the relationship that you have with that hiring manager, or what, I suppose, the complexity of the role that you're recruiting for. The other thing I would recommend is data is always going to be your friend in that position. So where possible, particularly if it's for a really complex tech role and it's a really small pipeline, LinkedIn Insights is great for this in terms of what the average pipeline or gender split on that pipeline potentially could be. Present that information to your hiring manager and say, you know, if I'm happy to target finding a woman for this role, if she is the best person for the role. However, this could potentially have an impact on your timeline and when you'll want to get this person in the business. And present a couple of options to them. I think presenting the full picture in terms of the impact, like how it could lengthen the process, is really, really valuable. Another question that's come through is, how else can you promote diversity as a manager within the business? So enact a policy of no interruptions would be a suggestion to me, or encourage co-workers to hold each other accountable in positive ways, but really be a diversity and inclusion champion yourself. There's a couple of suggestions that we have here in terms of maybe sending materials ahead of time, prior to meetings, for individuals who may process information in a different way, so they can prepare their thoughts and so they can be heard in meetings. But ultimately take a risk on other people. Like if there's a piece of work that needs to be completed, or a piece of work or a project that needs leading, their input could be extremely valuable and empowers them to contribute. Another live question's come through here. What do you say to someone who says, I just want to hire the best person, particularly when the best person always seems to be of one gender? I suppose it kind of links back to what I said before. I mean, we can't necessarily remove every single hiring manager's biases or what their assumption can be. It is an education piece. So I think another thing that I would probably fall back on is really looking at putting that work in at the front end in terms of really structuring the processes. Say, okay, well, we want to find the best person. So let's make sure that our process is set up for success so we can find that right person. So one of the things I mentioned before about coming up with that ideal profile and kind of saying, look, let's remove gender from it, let's remove ideal background. Like, what skills does this person need to be really amazing at this role? And what are the key behaviors? Like, are they solutions orientated? Are they proactive? Really sort of work with your hiring managers to define that ideal profile before we even start going sourcing. And then that can help conduct scorecards and the questions that we ask for that. And ultimately having everything aligned before we even go to market. And I think that's probably the best way to work around it. There's always going to be challenges, but I do think it is that education piece and really sort of presenting the data, making sure processes are structured and standardized, and also keep that constant dialogue going with our hiring managers as well. So what proactive suggestions do you have for those within teams that feel that they're experiencing unconscious bias beyond the hiring process, maybe within their day-to-day jobs? And could there be another webinar on this? I do think that is a really great question. I think, to be honest, that's something that we probably need to unpack in a little bit more detail. I don't think I'd be able to justify that with an answer today. But I do think that would be a really worthwhile topic for us to consider. I think there's a lot that we could look at for that. So thank you very much for that suggestion. And definitely we can look at considering that for one of our future webinars. So I think that's the last of the questions, which is great. So thank you all again for making the time to log on and listen to this today. I do hope that you found it useful. We will be sending around a copy of the slides and a recording for you to refer back to in your own time. We do have a number of upcoming webinars, so please do register on our website, www.talentful.com. And also my LinkedIn is here. So let's continue that conversation, and please do feel free to connect with me. Thank you very much for your time, and hopefully we will see you on the next webinar.